Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ultimate Perimenopause podcast. Today is episode number 15, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Shauna Drew. Hi, Shauna.
Hi, great to be back.
How are you today?
Wonderful, thanks.
Awesome. So today we have something a little bit special. We actually have our first male guest on today, and Andy Ramsay is joining us all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Hi, Andy.
Howdy.
Howdy, is that what they say in Australia?
We do now. G'day, sorry. To the colloquialisms.
So, you're the first guy, as I said, you're the first guy on our podcast. So welcome. We're super honored that you agreed to be here. And we just want to talk a little bit about your background. Now, I have your bio, but we want to hear sort of the juicier bits of your bio and your work in women's health. That you were saying in your bio that you've worked with over 4,000 women. So if you could tell us sort of in your own words, a little bit more about yourself, maybe even something a little different that we might not know.
Okay. Well, I started in the wellness industry. Gosh, it makes me feel old now, but it was, I qualified as a massage therapist back in 97, and then I did a 4-year degree in Chinese medicine. And I was very lucky to apprentice a Japanese master acupuncturist for 3 years. And I started that journey when I was only 2 years into my degree. So I was seeing a lot of patients as I was studying, which was fantastic. So I got on a very rapid process of training and education. And he was a Zen Buddhist, which was really wonderful because the experience in the clinical environment was very rarely would we say anything. We would very rarely talk unless we were asking questions of the patients. So I had to learn through the silence, through the presentation of symptoms and through the interaction with the patients. And very rarely would I get any answers from my sensei because that's not the way it's done in Asia. You don't ask questions, you learn by taking part. So in that time, in those 3 years, I saw about 2,500 patients at his clinic alone. And that was 2,500 pulses, pulse diagnosis, abdominal diagnosis, pelvic alignment, the balance of yin and yang, and all kinds of amazing presenting symptoms. And the majority of those patients were women. So when I started my own practice, which I ran for 10 years and managed a multimodality practice and specializing in obstetrics, I was able to move into that clinical environment with a very solid foundation in the common presenting symptoms, especially in women. So that allowed me to move into a practice and create a very successful practice pretty quickly because word of mouth spread quickly. And I think because of that training and foundation, I was able to have some pretty good confidence in what I was doing without needing to think too much or consult the textbook too much because it was direct experience, sort of hands-on experience. There's lots more I can share, but that's a starting point. I think that apprenticeship was amazing, and possibly what's missing in a lot of practitioners' trainings these days because there aren't too many mentors around willing to do that in the traditional way.
Yeah, and I think that goes for any part of the holistic health sector, is that we're taught that you go out and you create your own business. Not how's about working side by side with either an established holistic nutritionist or a naturopath or chiropractor or whoever it is to learn some tools of your trade and then move into your own practice with confidence.
Yeah, that was my path as well. I spent 5 years before going to naturopathic school working with different doctors, naturopaths, before starting my education, which was, so I guess I did the apprenticeship first and then learned the academics to put it all together. So I 100% agree. It made starting a practice in a clinic so much simpler afterwards, because I had a lot of experience working with patients already.
Yeah, and that's rare. That's still quite rare. It's certainly something that needs to be reestablished, I think. So I'll share just a little bit of what happened then. So in the process of having my own practice, we had our first child. This was 14 years ago now. Well, 15. He's 15 now. So we had our first child, and we did it. We had a home birth with 2 private midwives and a water birth, and it was amazing on many levels. But I was also involved in doing acupuncture and acupressure during labour.
Wow.
And so then when one of our close friends ended up having her child, and she was due to have a home birth, but she ended up getting transferred to the hospital. She was at the hospital, and she was chatting with some of the midwives and said, my friend Andy, he was doing acupuncture during labour, and it was really amazing, and acupressure and blah, blah, blah. And the midwives reached out to me and said, can you present a talk to our midwives at the local hospital? So I did, and there was about 500 midwives at this workshop. I think it was the first time I'd ever done like a public talk before, and I was a bit scared. But I taught acupressure in labour, and I also taught moxa, which is a heat therapy that you can use. It's like a kind of like a cigar stick, and you can hold it over certain points on the pelvis and on the inner ankle to help reduce complications in labour. And so I taught this to the midwives, and they invited me back the next year and the next year after that. And I just had a huge amount of referrals from the midwives of basically any complication that women were having. So my clinic just got filled up with pregnant women moving into labour and pregnant and giving birth. So I was treating women primarily, helping them with their cycles, helping them with fertility, and then helping them throughout the pregnancy journey, and then also postnatally, because postnatally was when women were getting the least amount of support. And it's interesting that that's also very much linked to what can happen in menopause. So what happens in the early teenage years for women, and then also what happens at childbirth, and especially postnatally, does have a big impact on what happens down the track for a lot of women. So that's something that I can talk about if you're interested.
Yeah, please. We'd love to hear how that connects. I also talk a lot with women about postnatal recovery because it's such a vulnerable period of time. So I'd love to hear how that all connects for you.
Yeah, well, traditionally, in pretty much every Indigenous culture, we see a women's cycle is honoured and very much connected to the cycles of the moon, the lunar cycles. Chinese medicine itself is a very feminine form of medicine. It has a very deep understanding of the female body and the energetic balance in the body, and how that then influences the hormones. So hormones are influenced first by the balance of yin and yang. Actually, all physiology is influenced by the flow of energy first. And then we see the influence in that intricate and very, very refined balance of hormones. So what can happen early on, as an example, if a young woman or let's say a girl of say 10 years to 12 or 13, if she's pushed physically too much, so say she's in elite gymnastics and her parents are pushing her to get onto the state team or whatever that might be, her body's using up a lot of yin energy, a lot of that energy that's actually also going to be drawn on for preparing her womb for being fertile down the track. and also her body's ability to generate her endometrial lining and then release through her cycle every month. So what tends to happen is if a girl is pushed in the early years, she won't have enough blood to start bleeding. So her menarche can actually be prolonged, and that has big repercussions later on in life. Another example is the pill. So the pill in Chinese medicine causes blood stagnation because it stops the movement of blood and it influences that delicate balance of yin and yang and hormones. So down the track, that can lead to complications if it isn't addressed at the time. So if you're taking the pill, it would be really, really helpful to get some kind of treatment at the same time to make sure that the energy keeps moving, because it's actually affecting the movement of energy. It's very powerful medication. So I think we underestimate the impact of that and how that can influence hormones. So what happens early on in a woman's life has a really big impact later on. So if there is a consuming of yin energy early on, what happens later on in perimenopause is the yin stops building at the same extent because you're not losing the blood anymore. So the body doesn't produce as much yin energy. So let's just come back to yin and yang. So yin is body fluids. I often say yin is like oil in a car. So we pour in petrol, which gets transformed into heat, which is very yang, and that moves the pistons and creates the fire and the movement in the engine. But unless there's oil to lubricate the head gaskets and the different articulations in the engine tends to dry up and head gaskets crack. So the oil is what lubricates the body. The yin is what lubricates the body. It's the feminine energy to begin with, but it's also body fluids. It's the lubrication of your joints. It's blood. It's all the sort of substance of the body. Whereas yang is heat. It's the energy. It's the movement of the body. It's all the movement of the fluids. So when we look at a depletion of yin, which is very, very common in women, also in men, it's pretty much the state of our culture in the West, is that we're all running on empty to a degree. Is that down the track, perimenopausally, that starts to show up, and it shows up a lot more in terms of hot flushes and things like that, because the yin is not getting produced at the same level as it used to be. So there's a physiological change that happens in the body. So really the best thing to do to deal with menopause is to deal with it many, many, many years earlier. But once you get to that stage and you're experiencing the hot flushes, really what it is that your yin's been depleted, and you get this heat that's rising out and up in the body that affects the heart and the head. So the core balance of yin in the body becomes imbalanced. So when yin and yang separate in the body, and the yin or the oil in the car gets too low, that creates more heat. It's what in Chinese medicine we call a false heat. And the false heat, actually heat rises. And so most women experience hot flushes as a rising up of heat, because the heat's rising because there's not enough yin energy to root the heat and keep it down in the body. Because a good balance of yin and yang is warmth in the belly and a cool head. Because in a good example is you look at Buddhist monks, they've got a shaved head, they've got socks and sandals on with, it's a great look, obviously. They can sit, in the Himalayas, as long as they've got their socks on, they can sit in the snow in the Himalayas, have a wet towel on their head, and they can work their internal energy and dry the wet towel on their head sitting on the top of a mountain in the snow, because they've learned how to regulate the balance of yin and yang in their body. But as long as their feet are warm, their belly's warm, and their head is cool, then they're able to access peace because their yin and yang is balanced. So that's what we need to get back to. We need to understand that everything starts down in the womb space with the balance of yin and yang, and having a focal point in the womb space, rather than too much focusing up in the head. That's what will actually help to balance your yin and yang.
Yeah, I actually remember, I'm going to post it in the show notes if that's okay. You actually did a video showing the yin and the yang, and the yin being really low. And it reminded me of how in perimenopause, that's what it feels like when your progesterone is right down there and your estrogen is right up here. That's what it reminded me of. And what you were just saying reminds me of it even more, because when I was in, or I'm still in that position, but my progesterone was so low, I was all up here. It was all about stress and worry and schoolwork. And that really fits with that, where you're saying you're more up in your head. But I'll post a link to that if that's okay, because that really did remind me of being in balance with your hormones as well as the yin and yang.
So could you, could you talk a little bit about the things that are happening before women get to the phase of heat? Because a lot of our listeners in perimenopause don't have the heat expression yet. So they've got, heavy flow, they've got headaches and mood swings and insomnia and things like that. So they're not quite at that full yin depletion yet, but there's definitely some imbalances there. So I'd love to hear, what are some practices that they could do to maybe offset that, so that when the actual menopause comes, it's less dramatic?
Yeah. So one thing that's really important to understand is that the presentation of yin deficiency, a classic yin deficiency, which is really, really common in men and women. I would say yin deficiency affects probably 80 to 90% of our population. It's not necessarily extreme, but it's definitely there. It's basically, when we look at yin deficiency, what it is it's basically the appearance of overactivity. A lot of people would call it sort of adrenal stimulation. When your adrenals are sort of overly stimulated, and it's very subtle to begin with, but what it presents as to begin with is just an overactive mind, and an overactive not being able to sit still, not being able to really stop. And it's so subtle, right? That's where it begins. And as it gets more and more depleted, as yin gets more and more depleted, the heat becomes more and more obvious. Now, for some people, what actually happens is the heat disperses to such a degree that actually yang starts to get depleted too. So when both yin and yang are depleted, it's called yang depletion, and you start to feel cold easily. So this is very common for women too. When they actually start to feel really cold at a bone level, and that means that their yang protective energy is actually depleted too. And that's sort of it's not as common as a classic yin deficiency presentation, but it's still pretty common. I mean, women in general tend to feel cold more than men because of the predominance of yin in a woman and yang in a man. But these days we need to talk of sort of, I guess, feminine and masculine energies. Whether you're a man or a woman actually does matter. There are different hormonal balances, but women tend to have a finer balance of hormones, to the degree that when their yin's depleted, they'll feel the heat more. When their yang's depleted, they'll feel the cold more. Whereas men can often push and push and push and not notice these delicate balances of hormone until they're in a similar presentation where their libido disappears, or they hit a wall and get fatigued, and it's not as obvious because they're not as in touch with their cycle. They don't have physical blood that leaves their body, every month. So it's easier for a man to not notice. So yeah, when you actually recognize that the yin is depleting and the yang is rising, that's a classic yin depletion experience of feeling heat or feeling overactive mind. And it's difficult to stop your thoughts. It's difficult to slow down what you're doing, and you're running on empty, but you're running on fumes, that sort of feeling. But once your yang depletes too, you can, that's sort of chronic fatigue, that's you feel cold easily. So then that requires it. What the mistake we often make is we try to work on the yang, but actually what's always necessary is to rebuild the yin first. The yin is our core energy. So when a lot of people talk about core energy, your core is your yin. And so that's what we need to come back to, no matter what the condition. So in my clinical practice, it was always about nourishing the yin, always, because everybody's depleted in yin. Because the society that we live in doesn't focus on, practices that encourage the building of yin, like taking a siesta during the day is one of the best ways to rebuild your yin, and have a daily practice of restoring your yin, which I can talk about in a minute if you like, and go into that and more.
Yeah, I think we'd both like to hear some strategies on how to build our yin, for sure.
Shauna, I'm not sure if I answered your question though. I started rambling and forgot the actual question you asked me.
Oh, we've lost Shauna. We don't have your mic.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Just curious if some of the other symptoms that typically come before the heat, which I think you did answer, because the overactive mind and the trouble sleeping and all of those would be yin deficiency as well, right?
They are. Yeah, they are. And the appearance can be, the deficiency heat. What we call deficiency heat is heat from a deficiency. And most heat in the body is a heat from deficiency of yin. Sometimes you can get like a true fire, which could be a viral attack, or it could be an external pathogen, or it could be from eating too much chili or something like that. But actually, that will still consume your yin. So there's really very rarely a true fire state in the body. It's usually always a result of the yin getting depleted.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, so there can be extremes of those heat symptoms. And certainly depending on a woman's constitution, every woman is going to experience it uniquely, because every woman is completely unique. And the balance of her energies are completely unique, and her constitution is completely unique. So in Chinese medicine, we look at constitutions. We look at, is this person more of a liver deficiency sort of person, or a spleen, or a kidney depletion sort of person? Like, they're all different, and even body types are different, personalities are different. It's quite funny, actually. One time I was at a workshop, and one of my lecturers, we were looking out over a beach, and we were watching owners and their dogs, and he was actually diagnosing the dog, the constitution of the dog. And quite often the dog related to the constitution of the owner, which is fascinating. And the dogs were balancing out the constitution of the owner. So yeah, constitutions are really important. It's something we miss too in Western medicine, is we don't really understand very well the unique presenting constitution of every woman. I mean, they're totally unique. Mm-hmm. So that's important. When you're looking at a herbal formula, or you're looking at a treatment process, it's good to see a practitioner that understands the constitutional differences in women, because then you'll be able to work at the core constitutional strengths and weaknesses in your energy and in your hormones, so that you can have the right formulas or the right treatment protocol for you specifically.
Perfect. Now, you mentioned liver, and as we know, the liver is a very important organ, particularly when you're in perimenopause, because it has a lot of work to do. A lot of women sort of tend to turn to wine at nighttime, just to get them to sleep or relieve stress, whatever they're doing it for. So what's the connection between stress and the liver? Because it's been recognized for thousands of years in Chinese medicine, but can you expand on sort of that, how that works during perimenopause? Because I stress, and I'm sure Shauna does too, we stress how important liver detoxification is, drinking your water first thing in the morning, etc. But it's still not really taken on board as something that's really important.
Yeah. So a great metaphor for the function of the liver. So every organ in Chinese medicine has emotions associated with it, has a spirit associated with it, an active governing energy associated with it, and a metaphor to try to understand how that function is and in its natural state. So the liver in its natural state, in a harmonious state, is called the smooth and easy wanderer. It's really like a sapling bending in the breeze, and it bends and yields accordingly to the strength of the wind. So the liver itself has the quality of grace. I mean, it has the quality of being able to yield. It has the quality of going with the flow. And so when the liver's out of balance, or when the energy is depleted, and especially the yin energy is depleted, what tends to happen is you get this sort of inflexibility, this brittleness can happen. You notice it in your nails. You notice your skin can dry out. But what it does is it affects your emotional state in the same way. So the liver tends to present as frustration, anger, all the opposite emotions of going with the flow, you know. So yeah, a healthy liver function, the responsibility of the liver is to ensure the smooth and easy movement of energy through the body. And so when the energy is not moving well, you can get energy that blocks in certain parts of the body, or it can create too much heat, and you can get this sort of overactive movement. It's like ungoverned energy that's just flowing all over the place. The other thing too is that the liver is like the general of the army. So in Chinese medicine, there's a lot of metaphors around governance. So the liver is responsible for acting on the impulses of the emperor, the empress, which is the heart, the spirit of the heart, which is called the Shen. And so the liver is really meant to carry out the orders of the emperor, like the general is meant to carry out the orders of the emperor or the empress. So what can happen when the liver has too much energy, too much heat from that yin depletion, and the heat is sort of in the liver and the gallbladder, which is connected to the yang partner of the liver. When there's too much heat, the general actually can invade other countries, other organs. So the liver can invade the spleen because it controls the spleen on the other side. It's wood invading earth. And the liver is related to wood. So it's that energy that the general can go and take over, and it causes big digestive problems because the spleen relates to digestion. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics that happen in the body, and that's one of the other things that can happen is the liver can overthrow the emperor with a coup. And so if there's too much heat in the liver, it throws the emperor out of the heart. But what's really fascinating about this is this happens very subtly, but we lose touch with our soul, we lose touch with our grace, we can lose touch with our gentleness and the wisdom of the heart by the liver, the general, wanting to control everything. And so you'll notice that there are certain patterns that happen in certain stages in a woman's life where you'll see a woman that has a lot of this heat and a lot of this fire wants to be in control. And you'll see that the soul is not as present. The control is more present. And so it's an interesting thing to treat in the clinic. what we would focus on is meditation. We would focus on yoga. We would focus on qigong techniques. We would focus on helping that woman come back to her grace. Because actually, this is another thing I wanted to talk about. When a woman is entering perimenopause and coming into menopause, and especially post-menopause, she's also entering a rite of passage. And traditionally, and in all Indigenous cultures, that rite of passage is one of the most important, because a woman at that age is then meant to she's coming into the crone years. It means that, you know, she's removing the hat of mother and she's moving into grandmother. And that's not, it's metaphorical. It doesn't matter if she's had children or not. It's a rite of passage into the role of grandmother or wisdom keeper. But to access that wisdom, she needs to get back into her heart and reconnect with her soul. So it's a really important rite of passage for a woman. And fascinatingly, it's what's needed on the planet right now, more than ever before. So you have this yin, classic sort of yin depletion. And I like to use these metaphors, because if we understand what's happening in our body, we then get a better understanding of what's happening on the planet, because we're all connected. There is really just the appearance of the body. Everything's energetic. So if we see the predominant state of women not understanding their wisdom or not accessing their wisdom, and therefore not being able to express it and embody it and be an example of it, we then have a world that is destructive, because that wisdom is not rooted and grounded in the actual world. But we're definitely seeing a really nice shift now. But that's part of what's happening in menopause, is that there is a life lesson involved. There's a rite of passage involved, and there is, it's absolutely essential that women get the support through that cycle to understand that it's a return to wisdom. It's a return back to their heart, and it's fully embracing who they are and what they're really here for. It's a legacy stage, to start to actually impart that wisdom.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, because you were talking about the crone years, and that sort of got twisted around to be, oh, she's an old crone. And it's that twist in society that getting older for women is not seen as something that is beautiful, and you're going through this transition and you have so much more to give. So that's unfortunate. We need to change that around.
Well, absolutely. And it's one of the things that's happened in human evolution is we've had matriarchal and patriarchal eras. We're at the end of a patriarchal era, and it's basically just yang getting to its fullest and turning into yin. It's because yin and yang are always in cycles. And we look at, perhaps the best understanding of this is the Ayurvedic or Hindu, the yugas, which is, I think, don't quote me on this, but it's thousands of years in cycles. And so we're at the end of, I think, the Kali Yuga. We're at the end of a massive cycle that's been a patriarchal era. So it's quite possible that we're actually entering the beginnings of the matriarchal era, and that we are definitely seeing that. We're seeing so many. I wasn't aware that we were going to go here, but I think this is fun.
Let's go there.
You guys are all right. This is about women reclaiming their power, but it's about women reclaiming their power through their grace, not some external idea of power. It's actually grace is the feminine power, and that's the doorway to wisdom, which is what we're missing on the planet in our governance, is wisdom. We don't have enough people coming from the wisdom of the collective. We have too many people still coming from the ego, from the old patriarchal era. So those systems, though, that we're seeing, those systems starting to break down, and the rise of the matriarchal era again, which is amazing. So women reclaiming in the early stages of reclaiming, and this, I guess, started in the 60s, and more recently with Me Too movements and things like that, where that reclaiming is starting to happen, and it's going to need to go through a bit of a process of, you know, the expression of and the repression, and the abuse and everything that's part and parcel with that. But I think one of the most important things is that women start to recognize that, and I don't want to say what women should do because I'm a man, obviously. So I should have said that right in the beginning, as a disclaimer. But what I'm seeing in terms of patterns and patterns shifting, and the reason I'm talking about this, because now I run a leadership company, I'm very much focused on what's happening with the individual and how that impacts the planet. But I saw it in the clinic too. You know, I worked with a lot of women in those stages and cycles, and I could see how things impact personally and collectively, whether those rites of passage have been nurtured or not. You know, right from the beginning, when a young girl has her first bleed, you know, right from that stage all the way up until menopause and postmenopause, those rites of passage, if they're not nurtured, creates enormous issues on the planet. So at that stage, you know, entering the crone years, where the only reason I think the crone years have gotten a bad rap is because of men in power feeling threatened by wise women. I mean, it's very simple at the end of the day. It's, you know, men that are in their distortion are terrified of the true feminine because it means the destruction of his illusion and his returning back to the truth of who he is. So it's a very confronting thing for any man to sit in the presence of a wise woman. Very confronting. And it's confronting for the masculine in a woman to sit with a wise woman too. I mean, it's all about the balance of masculine and feminine, but there are distortions in the feminine and distortions in the masculine. And I think this is what we're needing to look at these days and, you know, look with clear eyes at what's actually really happening.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, so from what you're saying, it's perhaps a really amazing transformative time for women who are currently entering perimenopause and menopause, sort of at that sort of threshold right now as we're going through these changes in the planet. That this is kind of an amazing place to be if we can nurture ourselves going through it, right?
Yeah, it really is, actually. It's something that can be celebrated. And I know when you're feeling those symptoms of rage, it's not easy to celebrate. You know, and when you can't sleep, it's friggin' awful, right? But it's just a reminder to rebuild that yin. And, you know, the best way I know of, and this is why I used to teach 5-day retreats on this, the best way that I know of to rebuild yin energy is to take a daytime nap, to stop during the day, buy a hammock. I mean, I've got one at the back now.
I don't think we would be able to buy a hammock in Canada.
Yeah, well, okay. In indoor
4 months of
hammock,
the year, maybe.
To take a break, and that does not mean read a book. That does not mean sit on your phone. That does not mean activate your yang. This is about your yin. This is about actually completely letting go. What we find is that traditionally, yang turns into yin, and yin turns into yang around midday and midnight. So you've got, if we look at the resonant field of the Earth, the resonant field of the Earth, what's called the Schumann resonance, is a measurable field, and the Earth's magnetic field fluctuates during the day. And if we were an animal without a thinking mind and getting lost in our thoughts, we would be able to feel the rise and fall and the ebb and flow of energy on the planet, and we would feel it in our own body as well. So between the hours of 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., it's called baby yin time. It's when yin is being born. And if you were to stop and just lie on the grass, for example, you would actually be able to feel and just focus on your womb, what we call the dantian, and just notice your belly rising and falling, and notice your mind's your mind and your thoughts coming and going, and you just keep coming back to your womb and just and feeling it rising and falling, and stay with it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, as long as you can. What you'll find is that you'll feel the earth start to hold you. You feel that yin energy start to rise in your body. The more attuned you become, you'll start to feel it. And so we used to do this, I used to take primarily women on 5-day Qigong retreats, and Qigong really translates as the awareness of energy through walking, sitting, standing, sleeping. There's lots of different forms of Qigong. One of them is Tai Chi. That's the full external form of it, but there's lots of internal forms as well. And I used to do primarily sleeping Qigong, and most of us would need hours and hours probably of conscious resting for a period of time to rebuild our yin energy. Depending on your balance of yin, you can start with 10 minutes and try to increase it. But yeah, I would definitely, that's one of the most effective practices, better than herbs, better than acupuncture, better than working with your hormones directly. The best thing that generates your yin energy is stillness, conscious stillness. And this is not activating your mind at all. It's actually the opposite. It's as soon as you try to, so it's like trying to stop a busy mind. When you do something to try to stop a busy mind, it's a yang activity that makes your busy mind, which is yang, even more yang. So the trick is to slow down enough, give your mind something to focus on, but have it focus on your belly, rising and falling. It's still slightly active, but it's more passive and still than it is active. Therefore, it's more yin, which is going to generate the yin. So that practice is very, very effective. We see changes in the pulse and the tongue, and the coating on the tongue indicates the balance of yin, and in the pulse we can feel it too. In even 10 or 20 minutes of conscious resting, we see a difference in the balance of yin. So it's one of the hardest things to do when you've got a lot of heat and fire. However, it's one of the most effective practices.
Yeah, I just want to switch it up a bit, because this is a question that Shauna we were talking about before, is that how your energy, that's that sort of that energetic magnetic field affects your everyday. And so we're talking about abundance. And a lot of women, we were talking about this, a lot of women who are in perimenopause and menopause are going through lots of life transitions. One of them being, they've split from their partner, their finances aren't what they used to be. So how do you sort of work in that abundance piece that could, speak to the people that we have who are listening, who want to find more wealth in their life, or want to find more love in their lives, or want to find more of themselves in their lives that they've sort of been missing, or they're in a different phase of their life?
It can be really challenging, because the first thing that's really important is to feel what you're feeling. Whether you're a man or a woman, that's one of the hardest things, is to actually feel what you're feeling. And so these range of emotions, anywhere from depression and grief to rage and resentment. It's such a full spectrum of different emotions that we can be experiencing in any moment. One of the hardest things is creating space to actually feel what you're feeling. And I mean, I still go through this personally all the time, feeling emotions that are very, very difficult to feel and accept. But what the only point of abundance that we have access to is the present moment. So we're either in the present moment, we're either in a state of lack, which are those emotions of they're usually the heavier emotions, and they're usually emotions around the past, related to the past, of those heavy feelings like sadness and grief and depression. They're more what we would call yin emotions. The yang emotions, which are still coming from lack, are the emotions of anxiety, stress. Are usually thinking about the future. So sort of rage and resentment is like that resentment and rage are sort of where you're on the cusp, like you're pissed off about something
just before,
that you've been thinking about it. Yeah, it's like, I want to freaking kill this person. So you're actually projecting it into the future. All of those emotions, I would say, are on the bottom scale, and they're in a lack frequency. So in the present moment, we're always attracting to us the result of whatever it is we're feeling. This is the universal law. It's also the natural law, is that you can't attract abundance from a state of lack. It's impossible. The only thing that you will attract when you're in a state of lack is more lack. So the way that I would recommend is that you've got two options when you're feeling anything. You can either rise and increase your frequency and rise above and try to reach for a better feeling. Try to access a better feeling. So if you're in rage, then get to anger. If you're in total depression, then get to grief or get to sadness. Like, it's just a gradual, slight change in your frequency, and you can just gradually move up. When you're at like the halfway point where it starts to flip into an abundant state, the first thing is calmness. The first emotion that you'll feel is the state of calm. That's where you're actually starting to access the frequency of abundance. And so calm then, so the lower end of the scale in the frequency of lack is all those emotions about past and future. When you start to get to the start of the frequency of abundance, it's a state of calm because you've actually entered the present moment, which is where abundance is. But prior to that, when you're feeling emotion, you're not. You're in the past or the future. And the trick is to get to a stage where you're not identified as the emotion. When you realize that I'm not the emotion is moving through me. So when you realize that, you can create a little bit of space from it, and then you can start working with your breath or whatever it is that you need, or have a glass of wine. Sometimes that helps too. Sometimes it helps. There's a place for everything. I believe that. Everything in balance, So when you get to calm, you start entering the frequency of abundance, and then it can keep rising. You can go from calm to clarity, perhaps, from clarity to perhaps a bit of confidence, and then you can gradually come up to maybe joy, and then eventually love. And the more you increase your frequency at that top end of the scale, you're increasing your attraction of abundance as well. And that could be financial, it could be about a partner. But the more, and I think in partnership, the more you can access that state of self-love, then a partner shows up that's not filling the void. It's a mutual filling of each other. It's
That's a very good point. You're not looking for somebody else to fill.
Not easy. Yeah.
No, it's
you're not looking for someone to fill. That's right. You're the reminder is to fill your own cup first. I have a good friend of mine who uses the word self-sourcing. Whenever she recognizes that she's trying to source something from outside of herself, she comes back to that state of self-sourcing, which I think is really awesome. Yeah, it's a good way of understanding, that what's required is actually to source that from yourself first. Source that access to abundance, that frequency of abundance within yourself. Therefore, you're going to be able to attract an abundance of money, or an abundance of love, or an abundance of whatever it is that you're looking for. And that is about the yin. At the end of the day, it is about building the yin, because without the yin, you won't have anything to root those higher frequencies of love and joy. What can happen, say, for example, in a heart constitution person, which is a fire element, is that you can fluctuate from states of joy and excitement to depression, and it just goes up and down spirals, unless you start rebuilding your yin, and your yin then is going to root that fire, and you get to experience a lot of joy, a lot of love, a lot of care, but you also have the self-care to ground that.
Yeah, I love how you speak about this stuff. It really, really speaks to me in terms of having a new perspective on it and interesting tie-in with the yin energy. So I think we're going to wrap up now. This has been a long, long discussion, but thank you so, so much for joining us today and for sharing your perspective of the hormone shift. And I definitely got a few awesome gems from the conversation and love the idea of women transitioning to a state of wisdom. And that's something that I'm going to hold with me as well. So is there a place that our listeners can reach you or learn more about who you are and your work?
Well, I'm not in practice anymore. So unfortunately,
we should have said that at the beginning, that you don't actually practice anymore. So if you want to tell us a little bit about the Wellness Leadership Academy, go right ahead.
Sure. Well, yeah, now I work with holistic practitioners primarily, and the company's Wellness Leadership Academy, and we run live events all over the world. I think I just wanted to see if there was any references or any sources that I could recommend. Well, one thing, let's get Oprah to be the next president. Let's do that.
But you don't live in the States.
She has mentioned that if enough people ask her to run for president, she will. So that's one thing. So let's do what we can to make that happen. Other resources. I would say learn. So rather than from me, take some time to understand rites of passage. Learn from other women and men that are working with those rites of passage, and understand traditionally what most Indigenous cultures used to do during those menopausal years, and do your own research and have a really good look into it, because it might be that you're not getting the support that you need, and that it could be that it's time to start building that circle of sisters again, and bringing the aunties together, and starting to sit around the fire and share your wisdom. I mean, metaphorically, it's definitely a return to wisdom, and it's a return to the matriarchal era. And so, yeah, if I was a woman going through that stage, I would be researching as much as I could to understand the feminine, to understand the truth of the feminine, and traditionally in Indigenous cultures, how women and the feminine were respected in their cycles, and start integrating that into your life. But I'm just a man. It's up to you.
No, not just a man. You are who you are. And actually, I wanted to take a moment just to thank you and your partner, Marcus, because Shauna and I would not have met and not be doing this podcast if we had not been to one of your events. So it's awesome. Such a deep thank you that you do what you do with holistic practitioners that have allowed Shauna and I to create this bond, this friendship, this outreaching to women who are going through the same thing. We wouldn't have been able to, I don't think we would have been able to do it without you, because you've kind of put us together. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Such a pleasure. Thanks, guys. It's great to be here.
Okay, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye for now.